Now, in any national government department, leadership resides in two parallel authorities: the national minister, who's the political head of any given ministry, and the director general, who is the head of administration. Both are mutually dependent and reinforcing roles. Although supplemented by a range of other key positions, ultimate responsibility for that department's performance lies with them individually and collectively. Now, the Zuma years saw continuous changes in both roles as the former president made redeployment the hallmark of his administration. What has this meant for good governance in the country? We're joined now by analyst Gareth Van Onselen, who's written extensively about this, and much of my introduction, in fact, has been lifted from what you have written. Good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, as we look at where we find ourselves, the Zuma years are over. We've spoken much about a new dawn under Cyril Ramaphosa, and yet we're still finding we've got a bloated public service. I spoke earlier to the minister, who says she has seen no evidence of that.
Well, that's not true. I mean, if you look at the size of the public service and the size of the public sector wage bill, they've both grown exponentially for a long period of time. In fact, far before Jacob Zuma came into power, but it did precede him by some distance. To the extent that Finance Minister Molisi Gigaba, before he became former Finance Minister, said that the amount being spent on the public sector wage bill is now threatening to breach a ceiling, so that if it carries on in this direction, departments won't be able to deliver on their core mandate.
That's exactly the question I posed to the minister a little earlier on, saying that a figure of around 580 billion rand or thereabouts. It's unsustainable. Something's got to give.
Yes, it does. And it's very difficult to determine what should give, because one of the problems with this kind of phenomenon in government is that once you've created a position, it is exponentially difficult to remove it again. Obviously, you have fight back from the unions and the public sector more generally. You can introduce things like wage freezes. You can put caps on how much you increase wages by each year, but all of that takes enormous political capital and will to get through.
The minister, in a budget speech last week, announced some changes. We know, of course, the president has spoken about reducing, say, for example, the size of cabinet. There are a number of cost-cutting measures. We've heard of lifestyle audits now for officials. We've heard that members of the executive must stick to the ministerial handbook in terms of staff complements. All of those, whilst sounding fantastic to hear, there really are cosmetic changes, aren't they?
Well, they are. Certainly, I would say the cabinet changes are cosmetic, given the size of the broader public service. However, I do think it would be a very important political symbol if the president and the executive took the initiative by reducing that executive and making some cost cuts to their own salaries, their own departments. It would send a message to the public sector union that we don't just preach the stuff, we practice it as well, and it might make negotiations that much more palatable for the unions.
But spare a thought for the unions, whose main argument is that so much money seems to have gone through corruption and other means, not to, giving delivery of services, but rather to enable patronage networks and all kinds of other shenanigans. And so they say, well, if you can afford to dip your hands into the cookie jar, we can demand higher wages.
Well, they've got a point insofar as the fundamental problem that underpins all of this is the growth rate and the state of the economy. And obviously those kind of things are impacted by maladministration and corruption. But if South Africa was growing at 6%, it wouldn't have the kind of problems and constraints it has with the public sector wage bill. And in fact, that applies to a whole range of areas outside of just the public sector wage bill. If we were generating far more income and far more capital, these problems wouldn't be as acute as they are.
Now, you talk about economic growth. One of the things investors have been saying they're waiting for is political certainty. That phrase we keep hearing over and over and over again. You've written, as I said in my introduction, extensively about the kind of changes we saw during the Zuma years, the revolving door of ministers, directors general, and other officials. What has that done to the instability of government, and how has that hampered economic growth?
Look, South Africans and the media in general focus enormously on the cabinet and the executive, which has, under Jacob Zuma, gone tremendous changes, about 123 changes to the executive. But director generals, as you pointed out earlier, are just as important, and the same number of changes under Jacob Zuma's term affected them, around 175. Now, the result of that is that the average minister and the average director general work together for no more than 14 months. And it's almost impossible to deliver on a program of action in a consistent, focused kind of way if you have that kind of perpetual turmoil inside departments. So it's something Cyril Ramaphosa is definitely going to want to bring under control, and soon.
And of course, we've seen yet more changes in the aftermath of the Zuma years. We're in an election season. Likely in 2019 or after that election, there are going to be yet more changes.
Yes, well, there's certainly going to be changes to the cabinet, you would think. But I would imagine Cyril Ramaphosa did some thinking about that, understanding that an election was some 18 months or 2 years away, wanting to get some core positions, things like the criminal justice cluster, the economy, put people in those positions that he could reappoint afterwards to keep stability. And there might be some changes on the fringes, but I think, yes, it's unavoidable that come the election, there will be other changes.
So where are you on the debate around a professional civil service that's not necessarily aligned to any political ideology, and the idea that you do need to deploy people in positions who can share, at least want to implement your political mission and the mandate voters give you?
Well, look, it's not just my position. It's a fundamental part of South Africa's constitutional framework, and as is dictated in the various pieces of legislation that govern the public service, that it must be independent. There are positions in the public service, it falls along a degree, that are far more closer to political patronage. A chief of staff, for example, or a speechwriter or a spokesperson are at the discretion of the politician. But the civil service more broadly, and particularly positions like Director General, need to be independent from the body politic in a way that is believable to the public. So they experience the civil service as independent, and professionalism goes to the heart of that.
So we now find ourselves once again dealing with wage negotiations as far as the public sector was concerned. We're expecting a big announcement today. It was understood that the government had signed the offer that was on the table. Now the unions are sort of backtracking, some of them saying they didn't agree, they need more time to consult. This is the usual sort of thing we see in South Africa. It's nothing untoward.
No, it's not. And I think the big achievement of Jacob Zuma's administration prior to this one, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who's adopted the same method, are these kind of 3-year wage agreements. So they've tried to bring an end to this kind of wage negotiation season, which almost always goes badly and results in much unhappiness and sometimes civil unrest. If you can get unions to buy into a long-term agreement, then you negate all of that for a long period of time, which is why I'm sure government will want this to work as soon as possible.
There's also been a discussion around the strength of South Africa's labour movement with emerging unions, or at least federations like SAFTU. That sort of unity seems to have been broken a little. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
Well, it's a good and a bad thing. I suspect it's probably bad from the union's perspective because strength in negotiating comes out of unity. But if you look at it from a competition perspective, it might be better because unions can play off each other. They can use the advantages of another union for their own benefit. They're not locked into one broad agreement. So it has upsides and downsides, and I suspect it depends on which side of the table you sit.
And that's exactly what's playing out at the moment as far as this negotiation is concerned. Gareth Van Onselen, thank you very much for your analysis in studio. Analyst Gareth Van Onselen here in the studio with us.